For this presentation, this is the Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna range in the railroad in the 1940s. I was wanting to do one primarily on the Northern Ordnance shuttle line that was in service during World War II, but then remembering that was within this larger picture of the Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna range, I expanded it just slightly. But to give some historical context, it's important to discuss the earlier history, briefly discuss the earlier history of the Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna range. These two photographs represent that. Now, in 1913, the Minneapolis and Northern built the line from Anoka down through Fridley to what would have been the Sioux Line tracks at the time, which, if 34th Street Northeast were to continue and cross the river into North Minneapolis, that's about where the Sioux Line tracks are located. And so the line was constructed by Minneapolis and Northern down to the Sioux Line tracks from Anoka. And then they purchased motor cars, gasoline motor cars, which in some ways were precursors to the doodlebugs that other rail fans know of, the self-propelled rail cars. They bought McKean motor cars and ran those. So this wasn't an electrified railroad to begin with. Those cars then ran from Anoka to the Sioux Line tracks, crossed over the Sioux Line Bridge into North Minneapolis around Camden. And that's where folks would get on the streetcars or do whatever they wanted to do in Minneapolis. After 2 years, that went bankrupt, and so the Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna Range Railroad was created. And that turned into an electric interurban. So electrical lines were strung up, and to have passenger service, the company contracted with Twin City Lines to have a couple of interurban cars created following the standard design, with some modifications, of course, of the Twin City Lines home-built streetcars. And so that's what we're seeing here. In the upper left, we have this photo dates from 1915 or 1916, showing one of the new cars freshly constructed by Twin City Lines for the Anoka lines of the Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna range. And then the lower right shows a later aspect of the line. So this operated into Minneapolis. It went, instead of through the Sioux Line tracks, it actually went down to about 30th Street Northeast and Marshall, where the tracks then went over to Grand and 30th, and then followed the 2nd Street Northeast streetcar line into downtown Minneapolis. Later in the 1920s, the Anoka line then decided to start using the downtown depot of the Electric Short Line Railroad, otherwise known as the Lucci Line, or Loose Line, never really determined how to pronounce that, in downtown Minneapolis at 3rd Avenue North and 7th Street North. And that's what the lower right photo is showing, one of the Anoka line cars. And I had the 20s, it's actually with the automobiles in the photo, it looks like the 30s, but showing it at the depot there. So that continued. This line had a number of financial concerns. I think it went into receivership about once or twice during its existence. But then passenger service abruptly came to an end in June of 1939, when a tornado went through Anoka and knocked down most of the electrical overhead lines in Anoka. And so this is a photo of the cleanup after that tornado went through, and I believe it was in June of 1939. But the Anoka line was not in the financial position to rebuild the electric lines in Anoka, and so they just abruptly shut down passenger service. So after 1939, the Anoka line became a freight-only line for a number of years. And then we all know that in December 7th, 1941, the United States was attacked by the Japanese Empire, entered World War II the very next day. And so with everything, with the transition from peacetime to wartime production, that affected a lot of cities throughout the United States, including the Twin Cities, and the Northern Pump Company was turned into the Northern Ordnance plant. And that was right along the line of the Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna range. And so the idea was, well, that can be resurrected. Again, it was a very decrepit, freight line, basically on a shoestring budget at the time, couldn't afford to do much else, couldn't even afford to paint most of their equipment or at least repaint it. And so it was purchased outright by, let's see, I think by the man named Lowell, who went with the defense contracts for the Northern Pump Company. And the line was resurrected for the most part, at least a few miles of it. And the passenger cars on the line were turned into shuttle cars. So workers could go from the 2nd Street Northeast line of Twin City lines and ride these shuttle cars to the Northern Ordnance plant. It was a couple of miles of line. So the Anoka lines had 3 cars that were then refurbished. And this is a comparison photo. The one on the top left shows one of the Anoka line interurban cars in Anoka, and then in the bottom right shows it after being refurbished. 3 of these cars were refurbished. 2 of them were put into service in October of 1943 when the line in the Northern Ordnance plant opened. But one of them was actually used for about a month or so in service in Anoka, switching cars before the Great Northern Railroad took over the industrial spurs in downtown Anoka. And so this car here, this restored car, actually shows, the bottom right photo shows railroad style couplers on the end of it, so it could actually switch out railroad cars in downtown Anoka. Now those were, I believe, taken off after this car was put into service at the for the Northern Ordnance plant shuttle line, but it's certainly interesting to see it with these couplers. One of the other interesting aspects was the Anoka line interurban cars were constructed to single end, following the standard practice of Twin City lines, because they were constructed by Twin City lines and their snelling shops. And then they were modified in September and October of 1943 to be double-ended cars for the shuttle service. And so you can see one trolley pole on the very front of the car in the lower right photo, and then you can't really see the trolley pole up on the trolley wire, but you can see the apparatus with the springs that would hold the trolley pole up. And so you can tell that this is a double-ended car. And as such, 2 sets of controls were put in, one at either side. And the next couple of photos show, these are newspaper photos showing the opening of the shuttle service with a very welcoming sign that says Northern Pump Company, trespassers will be prosecuted. But again, wartime fears, they wanted to be very sure this was a very important ordnance plant, so they would have taken their precautions, of course. This was done in coordination with the United States Navy, and so you have a number of Navy folks in the front smashing these bottles against, or at least posing to smash the bottles in front of the streetcar there. You have a couple of the waves that were, I believe, unfortunately, I'm not remembering what the WAVES acronym stands for. I believe Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service. I believe that's what WAVES stands for, but the program during World War II to let women into the Navy. A couple more photos of this. A better photo showing the streetcar. Again, they are sort of christening the shuttle streetcars right here after they were refurbished to double-end operation. And then we have a photo of one of the waves posing at the controls on the left side here. And then on the right side, we have an interior photo of the modifications made to the Anoka line interurban cars. Now, they would have had full controls at either end. They had trolley poles at both ends, and then they had longitudinal seats across it because it was just used as a shuttle service for a couple of miles between the plant and between the 2nd Street Northeast streetcar line of Twin City lines. A couple other things. One of the cars that was purchased when the Anoka line was still in better days in the 1920s was, I think in the year 1929, they purchased the interurban work car of the St. Paul Southern Railway. And so that's the one shown in the bottom right photo. But both photos here are newspaper photos showing the line from, it was a stop called Nelson. It was in Fridley, and it's actually right about where the modern day approximate location of the Nelson stop would have been where 694 just crosses to the Fridley side of the Mississippi River there. So it's from about that location to Anoka, the tracks were torn up, and these are newspaper photos showing this. This was in November of 1943, about a month after the shuttle service began. So at that point, there were only about 3 miles of track taken over as part of this project with the Northern Ordnance plant. And the former St. Paul Southern locomotive, work motor here, as well as another work motor that I'll show very shortly, were used to switch freight cars from some of the other railroads, from the Soo Line and the Great Northern, and switch them for the Northern Ordnance plant.
Good how someone has just hung their jacket from the plow.
What? Sorry, there's something in the way here. Oh, yep, looks like they did. So forgetting the order of the slides that I put them in, I'll show the other freight motor in a little bit. So this shows the line itself, the shuttle line itself, as well as the schedule. Now, the Northern Ordnance plant didn't only have this streetcar shuttle in operation, also there was bus service that was put into place. And so on the map here, the solid red line, which it may be a bit hard to see, but the solid red line is the shuttle route that connects with the 2nd Street Northeast streetcar, Twin City Line streetcar route. And then there were also 2 bus routes, one going from North Minneapolis off of the North Bryant line, and then one going off of the Columbia Heights line for Twin City Lines as well. So there were 3 services, 3 transit services bringing folks to the plant. One of them was the streetcar line. On the left here shows the timetable for the buses primarily, but then the bottom quarter of this image shows the services for the streetcars. And this shows effective October of 1943. At first, because one of the 3 refurbished streetcars was used to switch cars in Anoka, they only had 2 of these streetcars in service, so they were offering 30-minute service. Once the 3rd one was brought down to Fridley and able to and into Minneapolis and able to operate, they were able to operate 20-minute service. And it was 24 hours a day. So this kind of gives a little bit of an idea of where it connected with Twin City Lines. So what we're seeing is the street that I'm sort of highlighting here would be 30th Street Northeast. The streetcar line, the 2nd Street Northeast streetcar line came off of Grand right here, and you can actually see a tiny, but you can see a streetcar laying over. This photo was from 1930, so this was well before any of the modifications were made for World War II, of course. But the cars would then, actually, let me mention, along Marshall here is where the Northern Ordnance shuttle line came to an end right about this intersection. They built a concrete block shelter for folks when they were waiting for the shuttle. And then an agreement was made with Twin City Lines that some trackage was constructed by Twin City Lines all the way up to this intersection, and the streetcars would back the 2 blocks toward where the shuttle station was so folks could transfer over. That long track also helped serve to store some streetcars in preparation for rush hours of folks entering and leaving the plant too. And that continued. That was from 1943, and it continued till 1947 with Twin City Lines backing their streetcars up these 2 blocks in order to do that. But this gives you a general idea of the location of where this was and the layout of the tracks. A photo of the stop at 30th and Marshall. This does have the concrete block shelter. And then here you can clearly see the 2 trolley poles indicating that these were modified as double-ended streetcars. And just another photo here. There's conflicting information in a couple of books I looked at to see if the connection that had formerly been constructed by the Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna range between their line and Twin City Lines at this intersection was still in place. Now, certainly it had to be in up to 1939 for the Anoka line cars to actually go from their own track to the 2nd Street Northeast line here at 30th and Marshall. but there's conflicting information to note that, well, the city of Minneapolis wanted that connection to be severed at one point, and then during World War II, when Twin City Lines constructed that portion, or I guess reconstructed that portion of the right-of-way, they were loath to make that physical connection because they thought the city of Minneapolis would want them to operate the 2nd Street Northeast line along the former Anoka line all the way to the city limit at 37th. So there's a little bit of a disconnect of whether that connection was actually severed or not. But most of the information does indicate that it was severed. But nevertheless, you see in this photograph that that connection may still have been in place, or at least some tracks were in place here in the intersection. Either way, it certainly would have been helpful once the 3 Anoka line cars were refurbished because they were refurbished at the Snelling shops. It certainly would make sense that that connection would have remained, because it would have been easier to get these streetcars back onto what would then be the Northern Ordnance shuttle line. So either way, there's a bunch of information thrown at you, but this is again another photo of the shelter that was put in place at 30th and Marshall, and the stop where folks made the transfer from Twin City Lines to the Northern Ordnance shuttle line. So this is a photo at 30th and Grand. This shows the distance that the streetcars of Twin City Lines would have had to back down in order to get to Marshall. Now this photo is post-World War II, because we know that the TCCs appeared on Twin City Lines starting in 1947. And I believe this photo is actually near the very end of operation in the Twin Cities in the 1950s. But this shows again the distance the streetcars would have had to back down to do that, to make that connection to about where this blue car would have been in the background here. Actually, this is a this is at least 1948, because on Nicollet, the line to 62nd Street was built in 1948. So we know that this is at least 1948, but I think it's a bit later than that. Nevertheless, it gives you an idea of the 2 blocks the streetcars had to back down. And all of us are familiar with backing streetcars, so thinking of having to do that in 2 full blocks of a street. A photo at the Sioux Line interchange. This would have been roughly 34th Street if 34th Street continued across the river, but just showing one of the cars in service on the shuttle. Okay, so here is one of the freight motors. This was number 100. The upper left photo is showing it in service as part of the Anoka line. I mentioned earlier they had gotten to the point where they were so poor they couldn't even afford to repaint their cars, and this certainly depicts chipping paint and the motor, this work motor number 100, not looking in very good shape. And then the lower right photo shows it after being refurbished in early 1944 to switch cars as part of the Northern Ordnance plant. Transportation to Victory here is shown on a lot of the different cars, sort of the wartime slogan as part of the efforts there. This locomotive was actually a gasoline locomotive, so it didn't operate with overhead electric wires. It was then sold to the Central Warehouse Company, who electrified it. And then in 1923, it was sold to the Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna Range, where it remained to then 1944 be refurbished as such. A photo of it switching cars at the Northern Ordnance plant. A newspaper photo showing this, and this was taken March 15th, 1944, so shortly after this was refurbished and put into service. A photo of the shuttle car out on the line. This was also showing where the cars were stored within this fenced-in area for protection. This was during World War II when this photo was taken, but the year is not necessarily as clear. And you can see the former St. Paul Southern work car there as well. The line remained in operation. The Northern Ordnance shuttle remained in operation until April of 1948. So we of course know that that was a few years after the war ended, but the shift back to a peacetime economy took a bit longer than that. By 1947, Twin City Lines was not really willing to back their streetcars the 2 blocks to make this connection here. So folks who wanted to transfer between the shuttle and the streetcar line had to walk those 2 blocks. And then in April of 1948, the passenger shuttle shut down entirely. These photos were taken somewhere around that time, but I certainly wanted to include color photos to show what these cars looked like, what the paint schemes on them were. And of course, for wartime, they were dressed in a very patriotic red, white, and blue. And then after the war ended, the Transportation to Victory slogan was taken off. So the former St. Paul Southern car, which by the time the Northern Ordnance shuttle started, it was numbered 105, Minneapolis, Anoka, and Cuyuna Range number 105. It was sold in about 1947 or 1948 to the interurban line in Valley City, North Dakota. And it continued operating there until 1953 when that interurban line shut down. And so this is a photo of that car in Valley City, North Dakota, on the very last day of operation in, I believe, July of 1953. But certainly shows that this car was a survivor and operated for 3 separate interurban railroads throughout its career. And then this shows the locomotive number 100. In 1957, the electrified line was abandoned, but the locomotive was still used to switch cars up until 1966, when the Great Northern Railroad took over the whole area for redevelopment. This shows the locomotive number 100 after a diesel engine was added to it to turn it into a diesel electric locomotive. And you can see the exhaust stack, this curved exhaust stack, to indicate that it certainly had that diesel engine by the time. Now, this locomotive has been saved. It looks in a little bit of a decrepit condition in these photos here that were taken in the 1960s. But this locomotive has been saved, and it's now at the Minnesota Transportation Museum at the Jackson Street Roundhouse. It was donated to the Minnesota Transportation Museum in 1967.